Elizabeth Bruenig is a columnist at the Washington Post, where she writes about the intersection of religion and politics. She has a master's of philosophy and Christian theology from Cambridge University, and she brings that training to her commentary on the news of the day. She's here today at the Shorenstein Center at Harvard University to speak about religion, politics, and the left. Welcome, Elizabeth.
Thank you so much for having me.
So let's start broad. Why did you decide to start writing opinion pieces as opposed to, say, straight news pieces?
Yeah, so I was in graduate school when I started writing in earnest. I had always kind of liked the essay as a form. It was probably not something many people in graduate school would say. But I always felt like there was a lot of freedom there. And a lot of the writers that I was reading had written great essays. So at the time, that was like Joan Didion, for example. I just really enjoyed the writing process. It's a great thinking process. And I always find myself clearer and more convinced after I've written on something that I think than I was before I wrote on it. So just the writing process itself seemed very rewarding. And of course, I was in grad school, so even these small proceeds that come from freelancing were very welcome at the time.
Do you ever worry about only reaching a very specific group of people?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think a lot about polarization when I'm writing, that, if you seem, even at the very top of a piece, or even by reputation, to be pitching in a particular direction, there's a real concern that can limit the audience you can reach. And I think that's really unfortunate, because I want to speak to as many people as possible. And so I have found that kind of identifying myself as a Christian writer has allowed me to kind of genre bend somewhat. There are people who are very religious and are interested in religious commentary, who identify as conservative or Republican, who might be willing to give someone a chance because they're specifically writing about Christianity and public policy. And so I have felt like I've been able to kind of broaden my audience just in that way, and being open about where I'm coming from and what my background is.
You've said that your policy is to engage with anyone about your work. Have you ever changed anyone's mind?
I hope so. I mean, I've changed my mind a lot. I'm always learning, and I'm always open to being persuaded, which can make people feel a little uncomfortable to hear if they see you as kind of a representative of a certain political coordinate. They don't want to hear you say, yeah, well, that could change at any time. And it's probably not the case that very basic convictions could change at any time. But I'm open to, learning about new policies or, particular approaches. And I hope that even if people, don't necessarily change their conviction at that moment, they at least see the left in a different light.
What do you mean by that, seeing the left in a different light?
So, I mean, I think that the stereotype of the left is like the perpetually offended college kid, anti-American, anti-family, anti-religion, just sort of anti-establishment in general. And there are people like that on the left. But then there are people on the left who are very religious, who come from a very religious background, and who are on the left because of their religion.
So you mentioned that you're religious, and you've also studied Christian theology. How does your training in Christian theology relate to today's politics?
Politics is just a type of ethic. It's the way that we live together in society. So I read a lot of Christian thinkers on politics. I still do keep up with my reading. I'm always adding new reading. Something I really like about my job. But I mean, I think the intersections are sort of boundless, right? Christians historically have thought about political economy, they've thought about private property, they've thought about taxes, they've thought about, what we might call now welfare programs, that they might call, sort of social maintenance. And all of those places are, still very politically active locations. And I think that having a Christian point of view that's based in a long history of Christianity, that's not just America over the past 20, 30, 40 years, allows me to kind of bring that training to bear on all of those subjects in ways that I hope is helpful.
Usually when we think of Christianity and politics today, we think of the conservative movement. Why do you think it's important to talk about the intersection of politics and Christianity today, but from a progressive point of view?
I think there's so much in Christianity that clearly leans progressive. The emphasis on moral equality of people, the emphasis on willing the good of others, of willing the good of the collective whole, as opposed to a hyper-individualist, more atomized view of society. The emphasis on mercy and the emphasis on love. Jesus Christ's focus on the poor and the people who are last in society. the people who are sick, the people who are excluded. These are his friends. These are people who are very close to him. And I think that taking that seriously, that narrative of Christ's life and his example, is going to put you pretty close to a left set of moral impulses. Now, you can disagree about specific policies in specific places and times, but I think there's more than enough kind of progressive energy inside Christianity to fuel the Christian left.
You've written in a few of your pieces about the evangelical voting bloc, and I'm curious if you think there's a split happening in the evangelical community today.
There has always been tension inside the evangelical movement. Even if you just focus on the white conservative evangelical movement, there have been tensions inside that group. Some have been sort of disgruntled and displeased with how their alliance with the Republican Party has turned out for them. This many years on, Roe versus Wade's the law of the land, the progress they wanted to make in terms of rolling back abortion has mostly been on the state level, but they've been putting all this time and money into federal politicians who don't really seem to be doing anything for them. And so there's a certain amount of frustration. And then there are evangelicals inside that white conservative bloc who say, well, but it's the best we can do. The Democrats are much worse. And then there's, you might think of a more radical libertarian group in there that is, pretty firmly anti-government and feels like the only way to sort of shore up their cause is to kind of separate from society and especially from politics and to kind of protect their own community. So, I think that those fractures, those fissures in the evangelical movement have been present for a while, and Trump, as he is with lots of fissures in society, is emphasizing them, is causing those fractures to really pronounce themselves in a very forward way.
More broadly, the Christian faith in general, do you see fractures happening in terms of Christians' politics today?
There is such a tendency inside Christianity to think that in the earliest days of Christianity, everything was fine, we were all unified, everyone was kind of still basking in the reflected glory of Christ who had recently been on earth, and then from there, politics was introduced and personalities prevailed, and then the fractures emerged. But I think that the best research on the early church shows that there have always been pretty serious fractures inside Christianity, and that those have just persisted over time. There are just disagreements. You have a progressive form of Catholicism sort of based on Catholic social teaching that is reflected really nicely in Pope Francis' teaching, and then you have a more conservative form of Catholicism that was maybe more at home under St. Pope John Paul II. And then in Protestants, you have the same thing. You have these black churches, which are very vibrant, very progressive, and then at the same time you have white evangelical conservatives who are the single biggest religious bloc inside the Republican Party. And I don't think that it's uniquely American. I think that's just how Christians have always been.
You've said that your religion and your writing about religion and politics may give you kind of a broader audience than other perhaps progressive writers. I was curious, you've said that people in the alt-right have reached out to you. Mm-hmm. What have you learned from your conversations with people in the alt-right?
So I did a reported piece on the alt-right where I was basically just trying to argue that the modern day alt-right probably has more of a relationship with kind of romantic reactionary movements of the 18th century, 19th century than they're commonly given credit for, rather than being just a sui generis American thing. I think that, the one thing that I wished were more widely understood about the alt-right is you can have a mixture of illegitimate and legitimate grievances. And you can also be wrong about the source of your grievances. So I think there's a real tendency, and this has always been the case in American society, to attribute, whatever social ills, atomization, alienation, unemployment, inequality, you can attribute all of that to, the racial other. And I think that's been a tendency in American life for a very long time now, and I think the alt-right in large part has picked up on that. But they're wrong about the source there, but they're not wrong that those things exist. There really is sort of historical inequality. There's an incredible amount of alienation. There's a sense of sort of aimlessness and hopelessness, especially among the working class, that deserves to be remedied. It's just that I don't think that they're right about the remedy. And even saying that much, even saying the alt-right has grievances which are real, doesn't mean all of them are, but some of them are, and some of them are rooted in reality, even if they're mistaken about the source, has become a very fraught thing to try to communicate. Because you seem to be suggesting, well, what are you saying, that we should coalition with them? And I don't know if a thing like that is possible. I'm just saying that that energy is reflective of real problems, and I think that, the left should be very invested in addressing them.
Is there anything that I didn't ask that you want to add?
I think that's it. You asked everything.
It was a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much.